Welcome back to the show. This year, China is marking a major milestone. It's been 40 years since it started major economic reforms and opening up. We continue our discussion now on how those policies have transformed China and how they are impacting the world. Let's go back to Martin Jacques in London. And Martin, there's been rapid development in China, as we all know. We often hear that figure of 800 million people being lifted out of poverty that's been cited. It's now the world's second biggest economy by one measure, a growing middle class. Does anything concern you about this rapid development?
Well, I mean, I think the rapid development has been fundamentally good for China and good for the world. One problem is that it's completely novel. I mean, we've never seen a country with this kind of population, 1/5 of humanity, in such a short space of time, transforming itself and its place in the world. I mean, the rise of the United States, the growth of the United States, say, between the late 1860s and 1914, was much slower than this, and was also, of course, a much smaller country. So this is a completely new experience, not just for China, but for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has had to make adjustments to this and to respond to it. And it's very challenging because actually China's rise essentially challenges so many assumptions that countries around the world, especially the West, have had about themselves and about China. And I think that we're entering now a particularly difficult, a new and difficult period, which is the American reaction to the rise of China. Now, classically, countries that have been top dogs, my own Britain, for example, and now the United States, find it very difficult to adjust to the idea that their position is no longer quite unassailable in the way it was before. They go into kind of denial, and I think essentially America has been in denial about the rise of China and what it means for its own position. I mean, I remember State of the Union address with Obama when he said, no, people talk about American decline, this is nonsense, we're not in decline. Of course the United States is in decline. And I think that the more difficult relations between the two countries is partly obviously about Trump, but it's also about Americans beginning to wake up to the situation and what they think about it. So the growth of stronger anti-Chinese feeling in the United States, I think, is a reflection of this. And I envisage the situation probably, I don't know how, I think it's going to get probably worse. Is my own feeling about this. And this is an expression of what happens when, a new kid on the block, a very big kid, suddenly rises in this extraordinary fashion.
Pingkang Yu, China has also embarked on a very ambitious plan to improve its high-tech manufacturing sector in the fields like artificial intelligence, robotics, under its Made in China 2025 plan. How transformative will that be for the Chinese economy in the future?
Right. Well, I think it's quintessential for China to successfully carry out these industrial upgrading plans. Because those, and also you have to recognize it's fairly difficult and very challenging for China to upgrade these older manufacturing industries because it has a heavy barriers in terms of capital and technology. It's really hard to get through. But once these barriers have been gotten through, then it can help promote these knowledge transfer and spillover effects to get spread across the whole economy, and the effect will be very lasting. And I think related to the last speaker, what has put it, the challenge, I think that has two fronts. One is domestically, the other is foreign. The domestically is that in the past couple of decades, China has always had something to learn, to copy. That's what we call the latecomer advantage, because it had always have experience to borrow from the Western world. But now we've gotten to the stage that it's a fairly kind of at the frontier, and the further rise of the economy have to rely on the creation and innovation domestically. And then, so that's a domestic frontier. But at the foreign frontier, when the status of the economy, either in terms of size and the quality of the Chinese economy, has risen up to a certain level, then the China has to got adjusted to the new role it has to take at the global stage. For example, how to promote the international trade, and then multilateralism, etc. And I think that so far, it seems like the Chinese government has adjusted its role at the international arena fairly well, but we have to see in the future.
Perry Wong, Pingkang Yu there talked about international trade, multilateralism. As China consolidates its achievements so far, looks ahead, more reforms coming up, will that lead to more trade agreements, not just regionally, but globally as well for China?
I think China has been focusing, by at least from the officials' release, it's always focused on multilateralism than bilateral. Because if you're looking back how the Chinese government or Chinese industry grow their industries, it actually passed by at least a dozen countries for the electronic sector to complete a product, so to speak, in China. So I think China probably is a poster child of what the global or WTO framework creates. I think if that's how we want to describe it. So in that sense, China have to work on that or deepen that relationship in order for the nation to prosper. And I think secondly, on China's adventure, I would call it adventure, into bypassing the middle income trap. The only way for the nation to do so is to increase productivity. And by doing so, we economists usually would advise the countries or companies to up the value chain, and that's the only way. So that probably is the venue that the Chinese government would go on as a policy in dealing with international trade.
Right.
The more open trade, the better for the Chinese countries as a whole.
Anil, China's neighbor India is another major developing economy. President Xi held a meeting with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi recently. How important is that relationship as both countries move forward?
Yeah. I think the relationship is very important, and ultimately it comes down to size. So obviously we know that China is the second largest economy, and sometime between 2025 and 2030 it will quite likely be the largest economy in the world. India is currently the sixth largest according to IMF. By 2022 it will be the fourth largest, across Germany. Sometime between 2025, 2027, it crosses Japan, become third largest in the world. So if you look at, just 10 years out, that we are looking at China and India as maybe the second and third largest economies in the world, and and certainly two of the three largest economies in the world, and they are right, next to each other. So therefore, there is simply no way that they can, let's say, have little to do with each other. And in fact, they'll have more and more to do with each other economically and in many other ways. And so I think the meeting that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi had, we're going to see, and the meetings between the two leaders, if you just look at the last 12 months, the previous 12 months, and so on, they have become more frequent. And I think the likelihood that they continue to be very frequent is extremely high, and the relationship will become multidimensional. But it's naturally both cooperation and competition.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.